Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. So, what is ethics? What are some things that you think about when you hear the word ethics?
Your like the right way to do something, your duty, your obligations.
Okay, so your duty, your obligations, the right way to do something. Yeah, absolutely. It's your morals, your standards. It's, the what directs our actions is either being right or wrong. And so right, wrong, good, bad, duty, those are some of the words that we think of with ethics. It's, with the ways people either individually as a group decide again what actions are right or wrong, if one ought to do something, if you have the right to do something, or if you have the duty to do something. So morals are concerned with dealing with right or wrong behaviors, which is your conduct, your character. And so with that, we have values as well. Values are just what the worth you assign to an idea or an action are, and we choose our values. We choose them freely. They're affected by our age, our experience, our maturity, and they are modified as we grow and get older, as we obtain new knowledge, as we get new experiences. Um, so your code of ethics, your morals can shift as we get older as well. And then, a lot of your personal morals, your personal code of ethics, um, influence your nursing ethics. And at times in your career, as a nurse, your personal ethics may conflict with the law, which is our Nurse Practice Act, right? So we know that the Nurse Practice Act guides what we do. Can anybody think of something that as they have gotten older, as far as their values, things that has changed as you've grown older and gotten experience, life experience, work experience?
Nap time. I remember being a kid and get mad at my mom for trying to make me take a nap. Now I will kill for a nap.
Okay. I mean, that, you know what? I can feel that, Debbie. I can feel that. Um, so that is completely understandable. So the Western secular belief system, um, individual autonomy is self-rule. So everybody has heard of the term autonomy before. And what does autonomy mean to you? What does it mean to have autonomy?
Like control over
Is
your
it the
your
right?
body, and like, yeah, you're right to make choices on your health.
Okay, so to make your own decisions, right? So with this, the emphasis is shifted from duties to the rights of the individual, right? So again, individual autonomy is self-rule. You have the ability to think, and then based on your thoughts, you have or you can make a decision that is freely, whether you choose to or not seek health care, right? So you have the freedom to choose. Individual rights mean the ability to assert one's rights. The extent to which a client can exert their rights is restricted. So like the right to refuse treatment can be odds with us as healthcare providers, right? To act in a way that's going to benefit the client, to do good and prevent harm. So that is, a central theme of healthcare. We have to get consent for clients, from clients in order to perform procedures, um, to give their medications. They have the right to choose between alternative treatments. and then women's rights over their own bodies. And so these are a big central theme within healthcare at this time. And so there's bills of rights, there's, debates, in the state level, at the national level, over autonomy and individual rights. And so, we can think of some of the things that, potentially can cause some strife, when we think of some of the, the rules and the laws and things that go into, what is, the current state of healthcare. I'll just leave it like that. So the ethical responsibilities of nurses. So we come in, we, accept our patient load. We're caring for patients, that kind of thing. What does it mean to be a um a client advocate? What does it mean to be an advocate?
That's someone who can speak on someone's behalf to make the right decisions for them, to be able to have a voice for them, pretty much.
Okay, so we think of the patients that we are caring for. We see patients at their best, we see them at their worst, right? And a lot of times they are going to be in a vulnerable state when they come into and seek healthcare. Whether it's because of the symptoms that they're experiencing, and so we need to make sure that we are providing the best care and being advocates for our patients because of their vulnerable position. So one of the biggest ways that we can be client advocates is to educate them, right? Give them all the necessary knowledge that they need. And so, whether it's about their plan of care, whether it's about their disease process, their treatments, education and knowledge is power. And we all know that, right? The more we know, and even going in, if you're gonna draw blood or start an IV or put a Foley catheter in or do a dressing change, just going in and talking to your clients and explaining the processes, as well as why you're doing what you're doing. And so again, advocacy, right? Who does the initial teaching?
The RN.
The RN, right? And then we go in and we reinforce the education that's already been provided. And then, make that, if they have any additional questions, then we can always refer them back to one, either the provider or the RN for additional information. But our goal, right, is to make sure that they have all the necessary information to make that informed decision. What does it mean to be accountable?
That means to accept something you've done wrong.
Okay. So it's, who are you answerable to with accountability?
You said, who are you answering to?
Yeah, who are you answerable to with accountability?
You hold your own self accountable. I mean,
Very good. No, you're right. You are answerable to yourself, right? When you are holding yourself accountable, but we also have the responsibility to our clients, our, their family members, other members of the healthcare team. And so, holding yourself accountable. The measures for accountability, that's your nursing standards of practice, right? So what a prudent nurse would do in a similar situation. Client safety reporting. This is something that, and I hope none of you ever have to come across in your careers as nurses, but reporting peers, supervisors, any team members for behaviors that are potentially harmful to clients. If you have a colleague that is impaired, whether it's due to alcohol or other medications, if you know of them, you know, that they're diverting medications or taking medications that belong to patients for themselves, sleeping, any verbal, physical abuse, it is your job to report that. You cannot have impaired nurses taking care of patients. That would lead to patient harm. System-based issues. So these are things like making sure that, you know, if they have new equipment that is being introduced, whether it's a new IV start kit, a new IV pump, a new tube feeding pump, I'm trying to think other new procedures prior to them being put into practice, making sure that staff has education on the proper ways to perform the procedure or use the equipment. And if you're not comfortable, it's going back and, you know, letting someone know, like, you know, don't know how to use the equipment, education is needed. So these terms, I'm sure that everybody has heard before, the principles of ethics. So non-maleficence is do no harm. And what does that mean? What does it mean to do no harm? What are some examples that would fall under do no harm or non-maleficence?
Would a medication error fall under there?
Okay, a medication error could fall under there, right? So how do we, give me an example of a way to prevent medication errors?
Verifying name, date of birth, allergies.
Yeah, 6, right?
Okay, there you go. So using the rights of medication, right? The patient, their date of birth, absolutely identifying the patient. Making sure that we're using appropriate communication, right? So think of like your SBAR when you're communicating with providers or even doing your turnover at the end of shift. You know, making sure that before you leave the room, the bed's in the lowest position, they have their call bell, they can reach their water, their TV remote, their bed remote. You know, performing only necessary procedures, and then of course protecting those who can't protect themselves. So think of, you know, I'm going to go to long-term care. So like your dementia patients who really can't protect themselves, or your pediatric patients, right? Because, you know, they generally can't speak for themselves too. You know, of course they may have parents, but you know, what if parents are around, you want to make sure that your patients are safe. It's, you know, checking the temperature of the bath water before you put a client in the shower. So all of those things to do no harm. And, you know, it could, you know, when we look at some of the things that, you know, we do, I mean, there's potential side effects to a lot of the medications that we give, a lot of the treatments that we perform. And those are going to be normal aspects or normal things that can occur. And so even though we know that there's risks involved, making sure that we are performing procedures and giving medications, following policy procedure, and, you know, limiting the amount of harm that could potentially occur. What could happen if you left the room and the side rails weren't up and the bed wasn't in the lowest position? What could potentially happen to your client?
They may fall out the bed.
They could fall out the bed. What if you know, and it's the same thing if you you know, left things that were out of their reach, right? They couldn't reach their water, their TV remote, and they were reaching over to, you know, get those things. They could also fall out of bed that way. Beneficence means to do good. So when we look at beneficence and doing good, it's the basis of trust in nursing. All right. So we're putting the client's needs first. So this is your, good handoff from one, from you to the next nurse. It's making sure that if there is a medication error, that we're doing our patient assessment, that we're reporting it. You're placing the good of the need or the good of clients before your needs. And, just doing the best that you can for them. Autonomy, we talked about, right? That's the freedom to choose. It's respecting their independence, their right to, what's the word I'm looking for? Their right to choose their course of action, to receive care or not to receive care. And, you're going to give them all the information that they could possibly need. And that helps them to decide, on a course of action to, like I said, to receive care or to not receive care. What is to be true mean? What does fidelity mean?
To be honest,
Okay, to be honest. Okay. Um, and it's acting in the best interest of the client, right? So, and everybody has seen, I'm sure, the videos and the TikToks and stuff where nurses have been seen either making fun of clients or inadvertently or not inadvertently putting clients in their TikTok videos and posting them to social media. And so in addition to other policy and procedure and law violations there, right, we're not really, being true to our patients. Even, disrespecting their patients in front of other nurses or other members of the healthcare team is not appropriate as well. So just making sure that, we we understand that, there's going to be clients that are going to test your patients, and just knowing that it's not appropriate in appropriate places, to be disrespectful about our clients, especially to other members of the healthcare team. Justice means to be fair to all. And so justice is treating each client as the same as you would another client. So we're treating them with dignity, we're treating them with respect. And we are putting aside our personal bias. So, every patient has the right to respectful and quality care when they walk through the doors. And it is our job to make sure that we are fair to every one of the clients that come in. Which brings us to this. So this is what we call beneficent paternalism. And it is a disrespectful attitude towards a client, and what they can contribute to their personal care. So it's almost like a do as I say, not as I do. I know what's best for you. And it just kind of discounts the client. So it's tried, we don't want to, put ourselves in that situation where we are, trying to basically tell the client what to do. One situation, though, where beneficent paternalism is used, it's extreme circumstances, and it's most often a medical decision, where we may have to go to court to get either guardianship or permission to do a potentially life-saving procedure when parents have refused to sign an authorized treatment. So for the most part, when we talk about, beneficent paternalism, we think that it is, it's generally not a good attitude to have. It's not something that we want to incorporate into providing care to our clients. However, in that situation, if the I'm trying to think, there was a story, it's been a long, long, long time ago, but there was a child who had, I believe the child had cancer, and the parents had refused to do any of the medical treatments. So they had refused the chemotherapy, they had refused, radiation, all of the traditional cancer therapies, and they were trying to do the more herbal and holistic types of treatments, which we know we've talked about. We can incorporate herbs and holistic care into our treatment of patients with all sorts of diseases. But they ended up I want to say it was either, I want to remember what hospital it was, they ended up taking the parents to court because the child was going to die without treatment. And so they were trying to, get the parents to agree to treatment. The parents wouldn't disagree. So they had to get guardianship in order to provide care for the client. So again, it's only used in emergent situations or extreme circumstances. All right, which then is going to bring us into chapter 7. So chapter 7, this is nursing in the law. And so there's a lot of information in this chapter. And so with that, we have a bunch of different legal terms that are going to fall into play. We'll go through some of these as we go through the chapter, but just there are a ton of different legal terms. So we know the Nurse Practice Act. It defines our nursing practice. It establishes the standards for nurses in your individual states. And so you can't stress this enough. Know what your Nurse Practice Act says, what you can and what you cannot do within your state. And so within that, I mean, there's very similar guidelines and standards across the states, right? So that's why we have those the compact licenses, right? Or the multi-state licenses. But even with a compact license, if you're gonna, so let's say you live in Ohio and you're gonna practice in, I don't know what's next to Ohio, Pennsylvania or West Virginia, or whatever's closest to you, right? If you're not going to practice, in Ohio and you have your multi-state license, and you're going to go work in Pennsylvania, or you're going to travel and work in another state. It is still important for you to know what the Nurse Practice Act is in the state that you're going to be working in. They are similar in a lot of aspects, but there also can be differences that is important for you to know. And so with that, again, with the State Nurse Practice Act, it tells you it's a broad umbrella, right? This gives you everything that you can and can't do as a nurse. Your organization, so the hospital, the clinic, the home health agency, wherever it works, it can limit what you can do, but it cannot make you do more than what the Nurse Practice Act says. So I'll just use an example. We know that as an LPN, we can't push IV medications, right? You can't go work for a facility and they say you can push IV medications, right? Because that goes against the Nurse Practice Act. LPNs, we can hang IVs, we can do all of that, but you may have a facility that says, okay, no, we don't want LPNs to hang IVs. All right. So as long as what they're doing is within the guidelines under the State Nurse Practice Act, then you are, it's okay. So there are some similarities in the terminology across the states. So some of the other things that you may need, ADLs. ADLs are basic self-care tasks, right, that we all perform, whether it's bathing, whether it's grooming, dressing, eating, exercise. And so we help to meet those needs. The basic nursing care is care that it can be safely performed by the LPN, that based on the knowledge that you get throughout your nursing program, which includes your ADLs, your skilled nursing procedures. And then what we have is best client situation. So most of the time our client's condition is predictable, and things aren't changing constantly within those. And so, they might just be providing basic nursing care, and that's your basic client situation. A complex situation is where the client's course or their clinical condition is not predictable. So there's lots of changes in their medications and their treatments. It's just result of, continuous assessment. And so the nursing care expectations are beyond those that an LPN can do. So basic client situation, LPNs, we can take care of those clients. They're basically your stable patients. Your critical, your unstable patients, right? Those are going to be patients that the RN would have to take care of. Delegation. So delegation is a big part of what we are going to do. And this is where we are transferring a activity from ourselves to an unlicensed assistant personnel. So we also, as nurses, must know what the UAP's scope of practice is, as well as their duties and responsibilities, according to the organization that they are working with.
Ms. Mendes, excuse me, can you change your slide, please?
Oh, it's still talking
Thank you.
about, yeah, sorry, I haven't gotten to this one yet, that's why. So now we can go into the content of the Nurse Practice Act. And so the Nurse Practice Act, which are the rules and the regulations of each state, is going to include these things. So the general provisions, those identify the functions of the State Board of Nursing, the general procedures, like the fees, how much does it cost to renew your license, the licensure process. So how do you go about obtaining your nursing license? What do you need to submit to the Board of Nursing? It also will define the elements of unprofessional conduct, as well as information related to reasons for suspending or revoking a license. And it also will run the impaired professional program. And who's heard of the impaired professional program? Has anybody heard of that? So that is for doctors, it's for nurses, it's anybody that falls under the, I think doctors fall under a different one, but say you have an alcohol problem or you have a drug addiction, you can self-refer to the impaired professional program. It is something to support healthcare workers. It doesn't mean that they're not going to suspend your license, but it does mean, it does help you to get your license if you participate in the program. Other things within the Nurse Practice Act, your responsibilities. So it's going to list the general functions of the nurse, whether it's an LPN, whether it's an RN, advanced practice nurse, nurse practitioner. It'll also define the nursing. So there's specific definitions for each level of nurses, as well as the standards of nursing conduct And what else is the Nurse Practice Act also organizes, approves, and administers nursing programs. So all schools of nursing have to be approved by the state's Board of Nursing in order to operate a nursing school. So there's specific guidelines that need to be met, and even down to your curriculum. So, it's anybody ever wondered why you have to do 500 clinical hours or 600 clinical hours and, 1,000 lab hours? Not that it's 1,000 lab hours, but sometimes it feels like 1,000 lab hours, right? So these are usually regulated by the individual Board of Nursing. They're the ones that set those standards. And then they also will tell you what your continuing education requirements are for license renewal. So, does anybody know how often they have to renew their nursing license?
Isn't it like every 2 years?
Most states,
Every
yeah.
year, right?
Some states, it's two, sometimes you might get three. I know like for a CNA license, it's usually yearly, right? So it depends on your level. I know here in Texas, it's every 2 years that we need to renew. But continuing education is something that is also set up in your individual states. And continuing education is just, it's like it depends on where you work. I'm not going to say everywhere, but it's like things that are needed for licensure renewal. So, for example, so here in Texas, there are specific guidelines as to what you need to have, for licensure renewal, specific courses, I should say. And so each state is going to be different. So that's covered under your Nurse Practice Act. So when you go to renew, depending on your level of nursing, you need to make sure that you have those contact hours in case you get audited so that you can submit your contact hours for licensure renewal. The functions of the Board of Nursing. And so they license, they certify, they set the fees, they establish the standards for educational programs, they approve the schools of nursing, they determine the duration and renewal of license. Again, it could be 2 years, it could be 3 years, it could be 1 year, it just depends on the state. And as well, they are going to, require continuing education credits. They also maintain inactive state lists. They will carry out the disciplinary actions for violators. They develop the programs for impaired nurses. They suspend, they revoke licenses, and then, of course, they deal with the appeals process. So what are some things that nurses can lose their license for?
The death of a patient if they're found at fault.
Okay, if they purposely harm a patient, okay. What else? Obviously drug diversion, using, being impaired while at work. What are some things that could potentially affect your license outside of work?
If you get into a fight.
Okay, assault.
Mhm.
If it is a barrier crime, so an older person or a vulnerable person, or let's just leave it as a vulnerable person. Okay. Firearms, DUIs. There's a variety of things that can affect your nursing license. So that is one thing that you need to take into consideration. You get your nursing license. It's not just what you do at work that can affect your license. Shoplifting, felonies, things like that, can also affect your nursing license. So stay out of trouble with the law. So when we look at the unprofessional conduct, okay, so the Board of Nursing is going to define what they consider professional conduct. Um, and so, some of the actions, they can give you a fine. So the Board of Nursing can fine you, they can give a civil penalty, or they can refer to an alternative to discipline. So they can do practice monitoring, they can do recovery support. So for example, I've worked with nurses who had prior been caught diverting medications for their own use, and had gone through the monitoring program. And then the board has just restricted their practice for a period of time, saying that they can't pass opioid medications or any narcotic medications. Okay, so if they had a client that needed an opioid, like a Percocet or something along those lines, another nurse would have to be there to give out medication. Okay, so sometimes they will have some restrictions. They can do public reprimands, or they can do censure for minor violations. A lot of times that doesn't put any restrictions on your license. And so it could be a reprimand. They could also tell you, let's say, you got reported for maybe not giving medication or not doing a treatment or something, and they may just say you need to do continuing education in those areas. Others, again, the monitoring, the remediation, education, particular to the situation. They also can, like I said earlier, they can limit or restrict the aspects of practice for a period of time. They also can suspend, or they can revoke, or the patient, or you can voluntarily surrender your license. And then there's also other state things that, that would be dependent upon your state. So when we look at unprofessional conduct, these are some of the things that we're looking at. Negligence. Okay, so negligence, the nurse doesn't do what a reasonable, prudent nurse would do in a similar situation. And it does, these are things like serious risk to the health, the safety, or the physical or mental health of a client. If you violate the Nurse Practice Act, and I actually saw this recently in one of the states where a nurse became romantically involved, I'll just say that, with an inmate at the jail that he was working at, and he got caught. So you cannot do that. It's incompetence, which failure to meet generally accepted nursing standard or accepted standards of nursing practice. It could be negligence. Unethical conduct. So unethical conduct, that would be a breach of confidentiality, refusing to provide nursing care based on race, creed, color, national origin, disease, or sexual orientation, violation of the ethical code for LPNs, and failure to maintain nursing competence. And then of course your alcohol or drug abuse. We, talked about it. It's a threat to client safety. Some nurses steal, they either steal it and they use it for themselves, or they sell the diverted substances and equipment. So those are some things that you could be brought to the Board of Nursing for. So when we look at the disciplinary steps, so let's say your employer files a complaint, or somebody else will file, I guess it's a complaint, but they'll file a report with the Board of Nursing for whatever the reason is. And that, when we look at it, the Board of Nursing is going to determine if their behavior was unsafe, whether it was incompetent or unethical. And, is it a result of a chemical impairment, whether it's drugs or alcohol, and is it a violation of the Nurse Practice Act? Okay, and so if it meets any of that criteria, then the Board of Nursing will review the complaint. And they'll verify, where this, which state the person is licensed is, whether the act is regulated by the Nurse Practice Act, and they will also look at a criminal background check. And then they'll start their investigation. So they will do interviews and gather evidence. And then the board proceedings, that is when you will have your turn to respond to the allegations against you. And then the board action follows the board proceedings. And so the board action is, what are they going to do based on the information that they received and your response to the allegations. And so they can do something like an immediate suspension, they can do disciplinary action, they can do remediation. Emergency action is if there is, an immediate, or I'm sorry, what's the word? There's like a immediate need to protect public. They'll do an emergency action, immediate suspension. And that's just to, like I said, it's just to protect the public. Sometimes while they're in the process of completing the investigation. So this example, a nurse is reported for stealing a client's narcotics to the State Board of Nursing. So after receiving the complaint, determining the chemical has affected the nurse's judgment, rendering them unsafe to practice, and confirming the stolen narcotics are a violation of the Nurse Practice Act and the law, the board will review the complaint. The board will then investigate. So they'll question witnesses, they'll gather actions, and then the nurse will have the opportunity to respond to the allegation during the board proceedings, and then the board will determine its action. And then we have reporting and enforcement. So your nursing license is public record. So anybody can go to the State Board of Nursing website and pull up your nursing license to see if there is any actions taken on your nursing license. And then there is it's what we call NURSIS, NURSYS, which is a national database for varying license, for verifying licenses. So your license is on your State Board of Nursing, but it is also listed in NURSIS. So people from, anywhere can look up your nursing license to make sure that it's active. So there's that. The National Practitioner Data Bank, federal law requires that adverse actions taken against healthcare professionals' license are reported to the National Practitioner Data Bank. So on some of your Board of Nursings, not all of them, but like Virginia for one, if you wanted to see if there was an action taken against a doctor, you could also go to the Board of Nursing website and look to see if there's any actions listed against that doctor as well. And so, some of the things that we consider nursing licensure, temporary permits. So remember that some of you, when you graduate, you get your letter, you can work temporarily as a graduate nurse, right, until you pass your NCLEX. That timing is different. Some is 30 days, some is 60 days, some is 90 days. So it just really kind of depends. If you pass your NCLEX, you can continue working. If you were unsuccessful with the NCLEX, right, generally you'll be terminated. And, so really important, to pay attention to that. Working in other states. And so, there's the multi-state license, which, is a great thing. That's your compact license where you can work from one state to the next. Again, like I said, super still important that you know what your Nurse Practice Act is in the state that you are practicing, because you still need, you can't just follow the Nurse Practice Act. In the current state where you're licensed, you have to know what you're doing and, where you're practicing. And unlicensed assisted personnel is, supervision is a concern to ensure safety of care. So when we look at the UAPs, and this is something, if you haven't noticed this or not yet, You assisted personnel. These are things like your CNAs, your care partners, your patient care technicians, and I'm sure there's other names for them too that I don't know. You also need to know if you're going to delegate to them, you need to know what their scope of practice is as well, right? Before you can delegate any care. So nursing standard care, that's your guideline for good nursing care. And this again, this is your Nurse Practice Act, your nursing programs, your organizational policy and procedures, all the laws regarding the standards of care. Again, it's based on what an ordinary prudent nurse with similar education and nursing experience would do in similar circumstances. And so again, a lot of it is all going to fall under right here. It's your Nurse Practice Act. It's your NCLEX, right? That tests your NCLEX tests you for minimal competence in order for you to practice as a nurse. Your, written policies, how many of you, when you have where you work now or where you've worked, have read your policy and procedure manual? Okay, thank you, Jessica. So, I just find it interesting that some organizations are very forthcoming. Here's the policy and procedure manual. We're going to put one on the unit. We're going to put it on a share drive, right? So if you need to look it up on the computer, you can go right to the policy and know where it is. Others, they're like, no, we're not going to tell you where to find the policy and procedure, but we're going to hold you accountable for the policy and procedure, right? So one thing that you always want to know is when you are going to work is where the policy and procedures. So if you're going to be held accountable for something, you need to know what they are. And so how the law affects nursing. So we have common law versus statutory law. All right. So common law is judge-made law because it originates in the court. And so it's established the standards of legal conduct, helps to settle disputes, whereas statutory law is developed by the legislative branch of the state, and it would include the Nurse Practice Act. So your Nurse Practice Act would fall under your statutory law. With criminal versus civil action, so the criminal action involves people and society as a whole. So it's the government versus the individual. It's usually unlikely for you as a nurse to be involved in a criminal action, but it could be a felony or a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor is a less serious charge, still can result in fine and imprisonment, usually no more than a year. So that would be if you stole some money from one of your clients. A felony is a more serious offense that the penalty usually ranges from more than a year in prison to death. And so if you were, I think of like, anybody watched the show or I think it was a show or read the book, The Good Nurse? Has anybody seen The Good Nurse? Has anybody heard of The Good Nurse?
I have.
Yeah. If you get a chance now, when you get time, when you're done with nursing school, look up The Good Nurse. It's a true story. One of the nurses that I used to work with actually worked with him.
It's on
So,
Netflix.
yeah, it's on Netflix. But something like, injecting them with a lethal drug to hasten death, would be considered a felony. Civil action is individual to individual. So it's, it protects individual rights. It results in payment of money to the injured person. And so under this, again, it's some sort of infringement on individual rights, that there's some sort of a monetary compensation. Under this, we have torts. So a tort is a civil wrong. And we have two different types of torts. We have intentional and we have unintentional. An intentional tort is intended to cause harm to the patient. So you threatened your patient, or you physically harmed your patient. Your unintentional torts, you didn't mean to harm the client. So this could be something like giving the wrong medication, not following the rights of medication administration, not identifying your client appropriately. So again, intentional, you meant to cause that harm, you physically harm them, you threaten them, and then unintentional is you didn't mean to harm the client, but you still, something happened during your care for that client. Other examples of intentional torts, we have assault and battery. Assault is an unjustified attempt to or threat to touch somebody, and battery is causing the physical harm. So assault is your words and battery is your hands. So we also have false imprisonment and use of restraints. So false imprisonment is just detaining someone against their will. And so this is where, if anybody has ever worked in long-term care or been around long-term care, a lot of things are considered restraints in that population. Not just the physical restraints, the wrist restraints, but it could be chemical, so medications, giving them a PRN medication to keep them quiet, even though they're not exhibiting any behaviors, or it's putting somebody, in seclusion, without cause. Defamation is damaging someone's reputation through false communication, or communication without their permission. And the two things that fall under defamation are your libel and your slander. Libel is written, slander is verbal. So libel is defamation through written communication, and slander is defamation by verbalization. So you're gossiping. And then, of course, your physical and emotional abuse. Physical abuse is easier to identify, right? Because a lot of times they leave physical marks, bruises, cuts, tears. Emotional abuse is a little bit more difficult, because they're not going to show those outward signs. And if they're not reporting the abuse, right, it could be hard to tell. So those are some intentional torts that may occur. Unintentional torts, this is your negligence, your malpractice, and your contracts. So negligence is failure to use care as necessarily or as reasonably prudent and careful person would use under similar circumstances. So one of the more common types of negligence is going to be personal injury. Your malpractice, which is professional negligence, is it's a lack or it's it's a action or a lack of action, not what you intended to do. And so we refer to these as either acts of omission or acts of commission. So giving a incorrect medication would be an act of commission because you gave the medication, you just gave the wrong medication. If you forgot to give a medication, that would be an act of omission. Does that make sense? So commission, you gave the medication, but you gave the wrong medication. Omission, you just didn't give the medication at all for whatever reason. And so some of the other common sources of malpractice, med errors, working while impaired, not following standards of care, lack of observation and timely reporting, not using medical devices accurately. It's why I said, if you don't know how to use something, ask for education. Not communicating not supervising a client, you negligent delegation and supervision, you're not acting as a client advocate, or you failed to get informed consent prior to performing a procedure. So nurses are being named in lawsuits now. And so nurses have the, assume liability for our own actions. And so this is why it's super important that you have your own malpractice insurance. So your employee agency, they may say they have you covered, under their insurance policy. However, if they're only going to pay out $100,000, but the judge awarded the victim $300,000, then you are responsible for that $200,000. Where are you going to get that? So malpractice insurance is important that way. If you acted outside the scope of your employment, the organization that you work for may say that it's not liable for your actions and refuse to cover you under their malpractice insurance. If they decide to settle out of court, the plaintiff can then come after you separately. And then, even after a settlement, an insurer can come around and then sue the nurse as well. So if you have your own coverage, you have your own lawyers, so you know that they're going to look out for you, not just for your employer. So how do we prove negligence? All right, so this is something that is really important to understand. There are 4 elements that are needed to prove negligence: duty, breach of duty, damages, and proximate cause. All right, so duty is your responsibility to provide care in an acceptable way. All right, so based on your education, your policies, your standards of care, all of that stuff. A breach of duty means that you didn't adhere to the nursing standard of care, whether it was an act of omission or an act of commission. And an expert nurse witness will establish that standard of care. Damages mean that the client must be able to show that your negligent act injured them, and they have to be able to prove actual damage. And then proximate cause means that there is a cause and effect relationship between the act of commission or act of omission, and harm to the client. All right, so trying to think of something. It could be like, you're treating a diabetic patient and you're doing everything appropriately. You're giving them their insulin, you're checking their glucose levels, you're providing their skin care, all of that stuff, and they still develop an ulcer. Okay, does that necessarily mean that, you're negligent? So there has to be if you're doing everything that you're supposed to do, then they won't be able to define that cause and, that cause and effect relationship. So again, the process here. I'm sorry, I already did that. The steps. All right. So the client thinks that the nurse did something wrong. They're going to go get an attorney. The attorney is going to have a nurse expert review the client's chart to see if there was anything that was violated. And then if it was determined that a standard of care has been violated, that's when the lawsuit is filed. And then the client will file the complaint, and that is going to be, served to the nurse. And then the nurse, as the defendant, can respond in writing, and that's where the discovery period will take place. So, they'll do statements, they'll get witnesses, they'll get, caregivers, the client, all of that stuff. They'll review policy and procedures, and then they'll go to trial, where the verdict or the decision is made. And then if, it's usually going to be a monetary settlement. And then after that, of course, if there is an appeal, then that would be that would also, be after the court's decision. So again, the client's going to seek an attorney. The attorney is going to review the chart. They're going to get a nurse expert witness. Then they're, if there's any violation, then the client will file the complaint. That's when you respond. And everything kind of goes from there. But it's not going to go anywhere until that nurse expert reviews that chart. And then we look at privacy and confidentiality information that needs to be revealed. And so we spent so much time telling you about privacy and confidentiality and don't tell anybody anything. But information that must be revealed. And so communicable diseases, AIDS, STIs, salmonella, it really depends. A lot of it is state specific, but communicable diseases are reported to the local health department or the CDC. Vaccine-related adverse reactions are also reportable to the Department of Health and Human Services. There's also another line, I don't remember what it is, that you can report those to. Any criminal acts must be reported. So if there's a rape case, gunshots, or other injuries like that, those are also state specific, but especially if you're going to work in the emergency room, you might be reporting those. Equipment related injuries. So if use of a medical device results in injury or death, it is reported immediately. I was just reading something where a CNA had dropped a patient from a Hoyer lift, and then the patient died. I didn't read the whole story, so I can't tell you what happened. I just remember the headline. And then of course, any abuse of a client, especially a child or elderly, any that is reported to your supervisor or your director, and then, they usually will report it from there. So when we look at our clients' rights, what do our clients expect, or what do you expect when you go in and receive healthcare? You want quality care, you want a nice, clean, safe environment, you want to be involved, you want your privacy protected, you want help when you leave, and you want help with your billing claims, right? So those are things that should be offered to you and should be expected. HIPAA, I know everybody has heard of HIPAA. The main focus of HIPAA is privacy. So making sure that we are protecting their privacy. And so when coordinating care, we're adhering to the minimum necessary rules to protect clients' privacy. What are some examples of protected health information? What would be an example of protected health information?
The patient's chart.
Their patient's chart, okay.
Their social.
Their social, their name, their social, in some cases, their room numbers, right? Their medical record numbers, their diagnoses. So again, we do everything that we can, right, to protect our clients' confidentiality. HIPAA also dictates or requires that every entity has a privacy officer. So that privacy officer, so let's say you're working and you have a client that says, hey, I think that my privacy was violated. Then you're going to send that person, you're going to give the privacy officer's information to that person. That person can then report that. And so that an investigation can be, made into whether or not their information was breached. And everybody gets a copy of the privacy practices. which has all that information in. I don't know how many read the privacy practices. How many of us, we go to the doctor every year? Every year they give you an updated privacy practice. Does anybody read that? Has anybody ever read it? I've never read it. I just hope that they, don't share my information or sell it. But yes, so if you do think that your information has been violated, then you can we look at client competency. That is, how can they make decisions? But competency means that they are 18 years or older, they're a pregnant or married woman, they're self-supporting minor, which we used to be like you're legally emancipated minors, or they're competent in the eyes of the law. So incompetence is determined by the court. Okay, so if we think that there's somebody that is potentially incompetent, right, that has to go through a whole different proceeding. Clinical competence is the ability to identify the problem, why they're going to able to understand the problem. Why am I going to the doctor? What's going on? Understanding the options for care, the consequences, and making a decisions, and then, being able to stand on the decisions that they made. With consent, we have general consent, we have informed consent, and authorized consent. Implied consent is information that's received on admission. So if I trip and fall and I, twist my ankle and I go to the emergency room because my ankle hurts and it needs to be treated, that's implied consent because I took myself to the doctor and I want to get treated. Informed consent is for any invasive procedure, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's diagnostic, whatever, and it has to be for each individual. You can't just get a one big informed consent for a bunch of different procedures. Each procedure has to have its own informed consent. And that gives you, why the diagnosis, why they're getting the treatment, all of the expected outcomes, the benefits, it's the good, the bad, the ugly, all the potential that could go wrong. They also need to be informed of any alternative treatments, who's going to perform the treatment. So if you go in and you're witnessing informed consent and they say, I don't know who's doing my procedure, you're going to stop and you're going to go get the doctor, and you're going to get the doctor or the surgeon to come back in and say, hey, they still have questions. They don't even know who's performing the procedure or who's going to be in the room with them when they have the procedure done. It's also answering any questions that they have. So they have to make that decision with all of the information necessary. We can witness informed consent, but we cannot explain anything. All right. So the surgeon comes in, they tell the patient what's going to happen, and they leave, and we're having them sign the consent, and they start asking questions about the procedure. You stop, you go back, and you get the surgeon. Your authorized consent, parents can give. Parents cannot give informed consent, right? Because their kids can't, they can't give informed consent for their child, but what it's called is authorized consent. Basically, it's just saying that I'm authorizing the care that you're providing to my child. Talked about that. And then we have our end of life issues. So we have advanced directives. There's two different types of written advanced directives, living will, durable power of attorney. So the living will, it just, what do I want done? What do I don't want done at the end of life? Do I want CPR? Do I not want CPR? Do I want IVs? Do I want meds? Whatever it is I do, whatever it is I don't. A durable power of attorney, that is going to assign a healthcare proxy, and that person will be able to make decisions if I can't make them anymore for myself. All right. And then I know I gotta let you go. I got like 30 seconds. We have DNRs. Those are advanced directives. That's based off of their either their durable power of attorney or their advanced directives, right? That says that, they don't want any life-sustaining, CPR. Just kind of let them go. Okay. All right, any questions?
When did you say we were gonna get test results?
So I'm meeting with the team this afternoon. So either this evening or tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay. All right, guys. You guys have a great week. I will see you next Friday.
Miss
Okay.
Martina, did you
You
see
too.
my upload? Is everything
I got
okay?
it, hun. Yep, I got
Okay.
it.
Hey, Miss Martinez.